over. Someone's picking off costumed heroes. Attack on one is attack on all of us.
What do you suggest we do about it?
Retribution.
Watchmen. Rated R. In theaters and IMAX March 6th.
Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2009 comic book film, Watchmen. Now, Watchmen is honestly one of my favorite comic book movies. It's not one that I would watch over and over again, especially not the director's cut, which I honestly feel is the superior version of this film. But it's so well done, it's so well crafted, it's so impressive on so many different levels that, yeah, it is one of my favorite comic book films. Because there really isn't another comic book film like it that deals with such heavy subject matter, deals with such grit, such violence and brutality and really dark and deep themes. Like, this is a comic book film that sticks with you and really does leave a significant mark. And that's a big reason why it is one of my favorite comic book films, because it is one of those movies that does leave an impact. It's not one of those run-of-the-mill, countless MCU films or MCU-inspired movies that you see lately that are entertaining popcorn movies but don't really have much to bring to the table afterward. And the world that the film creates here is just a world that I love seeing. And it's one that I wish there was more of. I wish this was a mini series, to be honest, on HBO, which is interesting because there was a mini series later, but it wasn't at all even remotely as good, and it wasn't even remotely close to the actual comic book source material. I don't even know what the fuck they were doing there with that. But that's another story. To me personally, this is Zack Snyder's finest hour. I think this is his best film, and it's honestly one of my favorite DC comic book films, period. I was hooked from the moment I saw the trailer. The visual style was breathtaking and stunning, and it still is. And I just really was sold by the advertising. It looked like they were going to do it justice. I love the use of a Smashing Pumpkins song that was from the Batman and Robin soundtrack. And it just looked like it was going to be an epic, dark, really unique comic book film, especially for the time. This was 2009. You didn't really see a lot of comic book films that were this dark, that were this willing to be risky and edgy and so on. So it really did appeal to me. And I saw it in the theater, of all things, with a church group. Yeah, this is back when I was still living with my dad in Oklahoma City. And I actually saw this with my pastor and a bunch of other friends or acquaintances from the church. And I'm sitting in the audience and I'm just giddy and I'm loving it, and it's something that I'm really into, with the violence and the intensity and the craziness of it all, and the seriousness and the gritty nature of the movie. And around me are these really deeply, devoutly religious people, and the looks on their faces were priceless, because it was a lot of shock and a lot of horror and a lot of, oh my god, what did we get ourselves into? And then I remember distinctly, when the movie was over, I'm jazzed. I am absolutely in love with it. I loved it. and I'm positively giddy about the movie. And they are very reserved. They're befuddled. They're almost, you could kind of tell that some of them were a little offended by it. And the pastor tried to connect everything to the Bible and the Bible's teachings, and it was just awkward, and it was honestly pretty funny. I think it could have been some kind of sitcom scenario for sure, just to see the contrast of me being like, that was awesome, and then the church group being like, I mean, at the same time, what were you expecting? It's rated R. It's an R-rated movie, and it's based on one of the darkest comic books out there. Like, what were you expecting? It was going to be dark. It was going to be twisted. It was going to be really not something that is going to inspire a lot of hope or a lot of a lot of different things. It's not the kind of movie that you go see with a church group. So, and yes, the Hallelujah scene was one of the most awkward, but also one of the best moments to see in the theater with that group, because if I could have filmed or had the reactions from that group to show you, it would have been absolute gold. So, I can't really talk about the film without mentioning that story, because I think it's one of the few theater stories that I have that is actually pretty noteworthy. And I do feel that Zack Snyder was very uh, prominent here in terms of the reason for this film's success, because of the fact that at this point in time he had really perfected his style as a director, and he also had a lot of genuine passion for this film and for this project because he was a fan of Watchmen. He really liked the comic. Yeah, he did say in interviews that he liked it because it was violent and it had sex and nudity, and that's what he really likes. And you know what? There's a time and a place for that. And the fact that he embraced the darker, seedier, grittier, fucked up nature of the comic is a big reason why the film works as well as it does, because Zack Snyder gets it. At least he understands the visual uh, style and the tone that the film needed to even remotely pan out. And a big reason for that is because he cared. He didn't just do this for the paycheck. He didn't just do this for the money. And for a film that was considered to be unfilmable by the writer Alan Moore, or a movie that was in development hell for decades, the end result here is very impressive, considering all the different hurdles and all of the other different adaptations that didn't pan out and didn't get made. I mean, the comic was almost an instant phenomenon when it was released, and it was a critical darling. And of course, that led to studios optioning scripts, and they never really wound up being filmed. I mean, Terry Gilliam was going to do an adaptation in the 80s, I think the late 80s, early 90s, and it was almost ready to start shooting, but then the studio was like, we only have $25 million. And Terry Gilliam or the other people involved were like, that's not enough to do what we want to do. So then they decided to pass, and that sent the film into development hell. And then you had another version that was going to be written and directed by David Hayter, and that didn't happen. Apparently, David Hayter's version was going to take place in modern day, at least modern day for the time, instead of being a throwback to an alternate 80s universe like the comic. And I think that would have been a massive error on the studio or on the screenwriter's perspective to do that. I really think that would have been an absolute mistake, because the alternate 80s aesthetic here with Nixon being there for God knows how many fucking terms. It really is something that's vital to the themes and vital to the overall style and flair of Watchmen, and helps it stand out and helps it be unique from other comic book films. So if it did just take place during the 2000s or whatever, I think that would have made it more generic. That would have made it more standard, and I think that would have hurt the film. So I'm glad that that version didn't get made, because it would not have taken place in the alternate timeline of the 80s from the comic. Now, Zack Snyder, like I've said before in other videos, he's a director who's at his best when he can just focus on the visuals, focus on adapting comic book panels to the big screen. And this was such a perfect project for him to tackle in that regard, because there's so many panels in the Watchmen comic series that are cinematic that you could just adapt and tweak a few things and they would look amazing on the big screen. And that's definitely the case here with Watchmen. That's why I think it's his best film. I think this is prime Zack Snyder after starting to hone his craft, starting to figure out the best way to use the camera in terms of angles and zooms and pans and so on. And it's not an overdose of slow motion. The slow motion, when it is here, it's effective. And it's just one of those movies that visually, it's fucking stunning. It's a gorgeous, really great looking film from a visual perspective. It's dark, but at the same time, not too dark where all the color is completely gone. And it's just a really striking film. And I think Zack Snyder is definitely a big reason for that. I mean, it's so striking. Even my cat wants to speak up. Even Olympus is like, yeah, Watchmen is awesome. But where the he can't get enough. But where the film really does, I would have to say, shine equally is with the script, which David Hayter's listed here as one of the screenwriters, as well as Alex Tissay. But I don't know how much of David Hayter's script wound up in this adaptation, because I know he wrote a different version and things were changed here and there. But this script is one of the best adaptations of a comic I can think of. It maintains the themes and the subtext of the comic book series for the most part. All the characters, to me personally, are portrayed in ways that are authentic and respectful to the source material. The overall plot and the way that things unfold, there's a few tweaks, there's a few things that are changed. Like, for instance, the climax, it no longer has a giant squid, and instead it's Dr. Manhattan's energy powers that are being manipulated to cause devastation, and he's being blamed for it, and he's also the reason for peace. I'm okay with that. I actually think that works better than the version in the comic. Actually, this is one of the rare comic book adaptations that improves upon the source material. I mean, that's saying a lot, especially when it comes to Watchmen, which is a really excellent comic book series. And I just love the fact that the film was not afraid to be really dark. I mean, you got the comedian who is an absolute psychopath, to be honest, and so is Rorschach. Rorschach's a psycho, comedian's a psycho. It shows that these heroes are not really who you think they are. They're fractured, they are damaged, and as a result, they feel all the more real. They don't seem like they're pie in the sky ideas or ideals of who we want ourselves to be, which there's a time and a place for that. But there's also a time and a place for films like Watchmen that ground these characters and these superheroes in reality. And I can see why people find that appealing, because I do. I do as well. I love the fact that this is so grounded. I love the fact that you have the flashbacks to the original group of heroes in the 30s and 40s, and how they did not wind up with, let's just say, nice fates, all of them. I like the fact that the film is not afraid to handle or deal with subjects like abuse and as well as other political things. It's one of those movies that does have a political bent and does have politics and stuff like that, but it doesn't feel like it's out of place, and it doesn't feel like it's shoved down your throat either. So that's something that I definitely really appreciated as well, because it never really felt like I was being preached to, which is really the case with a lot of films that try to deal with this kind of subtext or this kind of storytelling. So yeah, overall, I love this script. I think both of them did an amazing job, a really stellar job adapting what was considered to be something that could not be adapted to film. I think they did a terrific job, and I think they deserve a lot of praise, David Hayter and Alex Tissé. And the cast. The cast is really top notch. I thought everyone was casted pretty much perfectly. I mean, Malin Åkerman, I thought she did a really solid job as Jupiter. Billy Crudup, one of his best performances at Dr. Manhattan. Matthew Goode, he was really effective and strong as Ozymandias. Originally, he wasn't supposed to, like, they weren't really going for him. They were trying to get a bigger name, but they decided to go with him because he was bigger and he was taller and he was more lean, and that fit more of the archetype or more of the kind of build that the comic book character had. Because initially Snyder wanted Jude Law, who was a huge fan of the character, but instead it went with Matthew Goode, and I think it was a good bit of casting. Tom Cruise also was interested in the part and apparently met with Snyder, and I can see why they wouldn't have gone with Tom Cruise, but it would have been interesting to have seen what Tom Cruise or Jude Law's interpretation of the character were. And then, of course, you got Jackie Earle Haley as Rorschach. This is honestly, I would say, his best acting role, his best performance. Definitely the most memorable. It's another role that he really campaigned hard for, and it paid off, because whenever I think of Rorschach, I automatically think of Jackie Earle Haley. Like, he did such a good job bringing this character to life that when I am rereading the comic now, when I read Rorschach's quotes, when I read scenes that feature Rorschach, I think of Jackie Earle Haley. Immediately his voice comes into my head. That's really what you want out of a film adaptation of a comic book character. You want that kind of long-lasting connection. And I also feel Patrick Wilson, I really did like his performance as well. I felt that he exemplified the character's naivete, you know, his aloofness, his let's just say foolish hope and pride, because he's one of those guys who just has this unwavering optimism, but at the same time, it's one of those things that when we're talking about this world that he's a part of, it's just not very realistic. And at times that can really get him in trouble. But it's also one of those things where he eventually learns things and has to sacrifice some things, has to ultimately break the rules and do things that he really doesn't stand for by the end of the film. And I feel the conflict with that was so well represented by Patrick Wilson. Although initially John Cusack expressed a lot of interest in this role. And as much as I really liked Patrick Wilson, it would have been honestly pretty special to have seen John Cusack in that role in this kind of film, because I think he would have nailed it. And then you got other cast members as well. Of course, you've got Carla Gugino, who plays Silk Spectre, the first one. Sigourney Weaver was considered to maybe play the character at one point, or Catherine Zeta-Jones, or Jamie Lee Curtis. Out of all of the actresses or actors in this cast, I would say she was one of the weaker ones. She did fine, but I don't think she was a really high caliber actor. Like, I think she was okay, but I feel that for this role that really had a lot of serious meat on the bone and some serious stuff going on with this character in terms of abuse and in terms of a child that was created out of rape. I feel that having someone of the caliber of Sigourney Weaver, Catherine Zeta-Jones, or Jamie Lee Curtis, or even Liv Tyler really would have helped that have even more impact. Because I always felt the performance was just, compared to everyone else, it felt like she was doing a skit. It wasn't as authentic. And I think the makeup effects, the prosthetics didn't help either, because they really weren't that great. So, yeah, I think that's a performance and a character that could have been handled better with a better bit of casting. But I mean, you can't get any better than Jeffrey Dean Morgan as a comedian. I mean, the guy was just perfect for that role. Smarmy, just an absolute fucking bastard, but the kind of guy that you still liked watching him. You still liked seeing him work. You loved seeing the guy, despite him being such a horrible fucking piece of shit. But even despite his really despicable nature, he had some legitimate points to make that definitely made you think. So there was more depth to this guy than him just being a straight up fucking prick that you love to watch. Stephen McHattie, he was fine too, as the original Night Owl, Hollis Mason. The rest of the cast, the Minutemen, they were barely on the screen. I mean, you had Dan Payne, who played Dollar Bill, and the All Matters Mothman. Apollonia Vanova is a silhouette. Glenn Ennis is Hooded Justice. Daryl Sheelar is Captain Metropolis. They were okay. Fine with what they did. They did a good job of what they were asked to do. Matt Frewer, I really liked his performance as Moloch. It was really quite a interesting twist to have this character showcased in such a vulnerable and sympathetic fashion for a villain. He's retired now and he's old and he's got cancer, and you legitimately kind of feel for the guy at this point. He's trying to move on, he's trying to be a better person trying to rehabilitate himself, and ultimately winds up as a part of this web of lies that's created by Adrian Veidt, who's Ozymandias, who's trying to do a lot of good for society, but in a way that's really questionable in terms of his motives. And the rest of the cast, just a lot of supporting roles. Laura Mennel, I wanted to mention her as Janie Slater, uh, Osterman, Dr. Manhattan's first girlfriend. Uh, really liked her performance. I thought she did a great job. And you had Robert Wisden and Frank Novak as Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. They were okay, but those performances also were a little for me. It definitely felt like it was a little bit too much SNL skit at times when it comes to their performances. But when it comes to the main cast, for the most part, really terrific. And they all had really good chemistry with one another, and they all worked together well, and really impressed. Really impressive cast, except for a few cast members that could have been a little better, could have been casted with better, more established and experienced actors. Then you have the score by Tyler Bates, which I would say is honestly one of his better scores. Really thought it was a score that fit the tone and the overall world very well. Accentuated the action sequences effectively. And yeah, I definitely feel it's one of his best scores. But when you talk about music and Watchmen, I mean, you got to mention the songs that were used here in the soundtrack, specifically the Bob Dylan songs, All on the Watchtower and The Times They Were Changin'. The opening credits of this film, with the flashback footage to the Minutemen, and then the fast forwarding to the present of alternate 1980 something. It's honestly one of the best opening credit sequences in cinema. I'm not exaggerating. I really do feel that way. I love that opening credit sequence. I love the way the music fits with each scene. I love the use of slow motion. I just think it's a absolutely stupendous, spectacular opening credit sequence. And the soundtrack, it was used well. I would have liked to have heard the Smashing Pumpkins song at some point in the movie, though. That would have been nice to hear the one that was used in the trailer in the actual film. But other than that, not going to complain about the songs that they used. The cinematography by Larry Fong, great. Just really top-notch, terrific cinematography. The film looks fantastic. The film was also excellently edited by William Hoy. I feel that it's quite masterful in that way, despite its length. And that's apparent when it comes to either version, like the director's cut or the theatrical version. Both versions feature some really good editing. And I don't really have that many issues with Watchmen, except for some pacing things. I mean, whether it's the theatrical or the director's cut, it does kind of drag at times because it has this vibe and this feel of a miniseries. And I think that at times makes it feel like it's going through the motions, or it's kind of pacing around a little bit too much before it gets going. One of those instances is definitely when it comes to the main cast of the new Minutemen, when it comes to Rorschach, Night Owl, and Jupiter getting back into costume and figuring out what's going on with the other Minutemen who were being killed. Forgive me here, I need to get a drink. This heat just fucks with me, man. So, as I was saying, it does take a little bit too long to have these heroes start being heroes again. So, I would have maybe trimmed some things or tightened some things up or had a few more sequences of them doing more. Speaking of doing more, would have been nice to have seen a couple more action sequences. The ones that are there with Rorschach or Night Owl or Jupiter are well shot, well choreographed. Definitely a lot of fun to watch. That's why I would have liked to have seen more of them. There definitely does seem like there's a lot of focus on Dr. Manhattan and not as much focus on some of the other characters, which is understandable when you have an ensemble film. But it might have been nice to have balanced things out a little bit better, because there are good portions of the movie that just feels like it's Dr. Manhattan's show. And I would have liked to have seen a little bit more with Rorschach or Night Owl or Jupiter. But those are pretty minor nitpicks, because I even love the ending. Even though it's not a very explosive ending, although there are explosions, I'm just saying in terms of the confrontation between the heroes and the villain, it's not very explosive. It's not even really that memorable in terms of the action when it comes to the fights, when it comes to all of that. But what makes the ending so strong and so powerful to me is what it leaves you with, how it makes you think about what you would be willing to sacrifice for peace. Would you be willing to lie? Would you be willing to go against your core values for the greater good? That is something that I think is very compelling and very captivating, and I think it was actually a really nice way to end the film, to have a moment like that. And to have the voice of reason be this crazy vigilante in Rorschach. That was quite brilliant. And I didn't have a problem with him dying. I know some people have an issue with that. I was fine with it. The comic, that's how things happened. He's a martyr because his journal was going to be published in the paper and people are going to know the truth regardless. And his voice will be heard and he will be remembered. And I think, honestly, at that point, this is my interpretation, I think he wanted to die that way. He wanted to leave this world. He didn't want to be a part of this sewer or this just absolutely despicable, shitty world anymore. And he didn't have the guts to kill himself, because that would have been something that he would find to be cowardly or beneath him. So this was his one opportunity where he could die in a way where he could keep some dignity, and he went for it. So there's something to be said about that too, as that's an interesting sort of dichotomy. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about the movie except yeah, great visual effects as well. I mean, some really impressive stuff for the time. Dr. Manhattan, for instance, his crystal machine that he builds on Mars. The film is 100% R-rated. I mean, there's a lot of blood. There's a lot of violence. I mean, Dr. Manhattan's blowing people to puddles of blood and brain and bone. You've got Rorschach fucking up people right and left. massive body count. I mean, entire cities get leveled by the end of the movie. Uh, One of those films that definitely is not afraid to go for the jugular, and it's dark in a way that fits. It doesn't feel like it's too overwrought. It doesn't feel like it's trying too hard. It's not a film that to me is too pretentious or too full of itself, which to be honest, I feel that the comic at times was like that. But I ultimately didn't feel that way about the movie. So if I had to choose between the two, I actually prefer Watchmen the movie over Watchmen the comic for that very reason. And yeah, I think it's a masterpiece in a lot of different ways. I love this film, despite the fact that it's a movie I'm not going to watch over and over again, but that's mainly because of its tone. It's such a depressing, fucked up movie that it's not a film that is always a crowd pleaser, but that's not the point. So it's something that I admire and I love and I appreciate deeply, but it's also something that I definitely have limits with because I got to be in the right mood for it. And I feel it's a movie that I'm able to savor more by not watching it over and over again. Because then when I rewatch it, then I can catch things that I didn't get the first time, or I can really chew on a few more thoughts or a few more elements, uh, more than I might have been able to otherwise if I just watched it religiously. And when it comes to this film, uh, this is the a standard Blu-ray release of the director's cut. The reason why I'm showcasing this one is this is the one that I rewatched, because the 4K release it includes Tales of the Black Freighter, and it just makes this director's cut, which is already 3 hours long, even longer. And I don't like the Tales of the Black Freighter as a part of this story. I didn't like it in the comic, and I don't like it in the film. I don't think it fits. It just feels out of place. Uh, so I prefer this version, and it's too bad they didn't remaster just the regular director's cut. Why do we have to have Tales of the Black Freighter in there shoved in? I don't want it. Don't need it. Just give me this in 4K. That being said, this Blu-ray looks damn near close to the 4K on my setup, up converted to HD. I'm not kidding. It looks almost identical. I could barely even tell the difference when it comes to the transfer. So, this is one of those older transfers that still holds up brilliantly. So, yeah, I really don't have anything else to say about the movie except it's one of those films that to me is genuinely special. It's a special comic book film. It's a unique comic book film. And I don't think there is another comic book film like it that I can think of off the top of my head. So, I think it's one of those films that, for better or worse, I think pretty much anyone can appreciate on some level. And that's what the fact that this is such a great and brilliant film in so many different ways makes Snyder's DC films so much more disappointing in retrospect. It's just like, what the fuck happened, man? Like, really? I mean, you go from this to Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman. People who think Justice League is some masterpiece and makes you think and it's deep and whatever, give me a fucking break. Watchmen. That's the superhero film that Snyder was involved with, to me, that is genuinely deep, that is thought provoking, and is a masterpiece.